On a stool. Sorry. I don't know what I've done to my foot, but I did something. And it's kind of annoying, to be honest with you. Especially if it's, as some people think, is gout. Because I'm too young to have gout, aren't I? Dave says no. Are you saying I'm old, Dave? Are you saying I'm old?
Yes.
Okay. He's honest. There you go. It happens. All right. All right. Well, anyway, so my foot's in pain, but it may mean a shorter sermon because I don't know. I may have to not preach much longer than I'm going to want to be. Anyway, you know how that goes. I'll probably get through it. It feels weird to sit down on a stool, but anyway, that's all right. We're going to get through this. This is a challenging passage. It really is. As we look at this passage in a whole and what happens at the end, I think I understand what's happening and why Paul did what he did, and I hope to make that application for our own lives, and I hope it's a help to us. But we're going to chip away at this and begin at the beginning where it's much easier to deal with. How's that sound? Last week we talked about the first parts of this chapter where we saw Paul continue on his trip to Jerusalem. We see now he finally makes it to Jerusalem. We begin in verse 15. After these days we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. And some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Mason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. So after that goodbye in Caesarea, Paul and his companions went to Jerusalem. It's about a 60-mile trip by road. When they got to Jerusalem, they stayed with this guy named Nason. We don't know much about him besides his name was Nason. How's that? And that he was an early disciple. I think the King James interprets it a different way, but the idea is he was a disciple for a long time. The idea is that he was likely one of the early converts, possibly even at the day of Pentecost. He was one of those that followed Christ early on, and so they stayed with them. And although here it says he's from Cyprus, remember during that time, many of the believers were from out of Jerusalem anyway that got saved that day and that's why they had the day of Pentecost, because all the different languages. So it's very likely that he was there at Pentecost. It's safe to say if he wasn't saved at that point in time, it was not too long after, since Luke emphasizes that he was an early disciple. So they make their trip from Caesarea to Jerusalem. They stay with this gentleman named Nason, and that's where we pick it up in verse 17. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. I think I can understand why they received him gladly on a couple fronts. First off, remember that he was returning after being gone for about 8 years while he was on this third missionary journey. I think we can relate to the joy of having people return who came back from, to see our missionaries that we support. When they come back, we're pretty excited to see them. It's good to hear from them. It's a joyous time when they return. We hear what God has done in their lives. And remember, we get to hear from our missionaries a little bit easier than Paul got to hear, or they got to hear from Paul while he was gone. And secondly, remember that they were receiving an offering from Paul. It always makes it a little more joyous times when you're getting some relief from your famine. And so these people in Jerusalem were probably very excited to see Paul. But at this time, it's just by the brothers, it says. Well, who these brothers were that had welcomed him in, we're not sure, but it doesn't appear that it's the leaders of the church at the time, which is interesting. It says in verse 18, on the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. So James, who was the leader of the church at this time, remember Peter had left. Many people believe he was in Rome at the time. We're not sure where he was exactly. According to church tradition and some of the historians, he was in Rome. John was still at the church of Jerusalem at this time, but it's not clear if he was at this meeting or not. But it is mentioned that James, the half-brother of Christ. We do know that there were other leaders here too, because it says that, James and the elders. There's a lot of debate about the size of the church at this point in time. Some people think that the church of Jerusalem was at as high as 25,000 people. Other people say, well, probably not, because they were all dispersed during the time of the persecution. How many people were at the church in Jerusalem this time? We have no idea. It could have been as little as 500 and as many as 25,000. We do know that there was quite a few elders, though. It's plural. And you can imagine if there was quite a few believers, they needed the elders in order to accomplish the ministry, especially since most of the disciples at this time, the early apostles, had been dispersed throughout the other regions. So the elders had taken on more of a role of leading the church. Who all of them were, we're not sure at this point either, besides John and Peter, who were still in Jerusalem during this time. So there was a meeting, though, between Paul and these church leaders. Now we see in verse 19, it says, after greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Now, what I'm taking this is that he's telling them about what happened in the third missionary journey, because he had already reported back about the second missionary journey and the first missionary journey. But during that third missionary journey, well, you tell me, what do you remember happening in that third missionary journey? Some exciting things that he would have reported back. I have the whole list here, but I'm not going to share it because I want quiz time. Can you think of anything exciting? Look back. You can look back a couple chapters if you like. Begins in chapter 18. Okay, Corinth began, and that was quite a situation there, right? Anybody else remember anything? How about a guy that fell out of a window? I mean, that would have been quite a deal, right? There was also the account of as Paul was doing great miracles and delivering spirits up, there was the 7 sons of Sceva that came up and decided they wanted to mimic Paul and cast demons out in the name of Paul and Christ. Remember what the demons said? We know Paul, we know Christ, who are you? And then what happened to them? They got possessed. The very people that were trying to cast out the demons. Okay, that was a big deal. What else do we see? Yeah, that was a big deal too. And the deliverance from that riot. I mean, just that in itself was quite a deal. When Ephesus, when they were bringing Paul in they didn't like them taking away some of the business, and so they were kind of start the business of the idol making. And so they were starting a riot, and the people brought, Paul wanted to speak for himself, but some of his companions said, you better not, and we're getting you out of here. And so that was quite a situation. And then he just stopped by a lot of churches, right? And stopped by a lot of the small towns and made inroads there. And he stayed quite a while at Ephesus, continued to proclaim the gospel there. And so it was a lot of proclaiming the gospel to Gentiles who had not heard before, making a huge difference in a lot of these towns. And so Paul had plenty to report back to this church in Jerusalem. There was a lot that was happening that had happened in the Gentile church, that the Gentile churches, that the people of Israel wanted to hear about. You know, riots, dead guys being raised from the dead, remember the plot to ambush Paul on his way back from Jerusalem, or he's going to take a ship from Corinth to Ephesus. There was a plot to get him on the ship, and instead they went by land and ended up going back through the north area. I mean, all those things that had happened, pretty crazy. And the elders got to hear about it all. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm sitting there listening to all that, I'm kind of on a high here going, wow, this is amazing. Look what God's done. This is great. And it started that way. Look at verse 20. And when they heard it, they glorified God. Okay, that's great. Now, it's interesting, and it's good that it's God being glorified. The praise is going to God. That should be the response. If anybody had reason to boast, it would be Paul of how God had used him, but he didn't. Instead, all the glory went to God. And that's how it should be in our ministries as well. It's all about what God has done and how he has accomplished what he's accomplished. And Paul could have tried to turn the attention to himself, but instead he gave it to Christ, and that's the idea. But this joy and this excitement is short-lived, because notice what happens in verse 20, the second part of verse 20. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law." So here these folks in Jerusalem, what are they concerned about? How the Jews are going to receive Paul. As it says there in verse 21, we'll get to this in a minute, but it says, "And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs." Now, it's really interesting how quickly, yay, look what God's been doing in the life of the Gentiles. Woohoo, this is great. Oh yeah, but wait a minute, we got a big problem over here. And many times that's the way it is in ministry. You have a really exciting point, and then comes the, oh man, now look what we got to deal with. And that's how it works sometimes. A lot of times, unfortunately. You have a victory, and Satan attacks. What's interesting here to me, and I wonder if Paul wasn't completely blindsided by this situation. What James and the elders of the church say is that there are thousands who are among the Jews who have believed in Christ, and that those Jews are still zealous for the law. Why were they still zealous for the law? Why didn't they understand that Christ had fulfilled the law, that they were free from the law now, that there was not a reason for them to continue in the law? If the apostles and if the elders of the church had been doing what they were supposed to be doing and preaching Christ and preaching him as fulfilling the law, this shouldn't have been an issue. That's where my mind goes. And if I was Paul, that's probably what I would have said. Well, you dopes, you should have done what you're supposed to do. We wouldn't have this problem right now. That probably wouldn't have been very nice, though. But that's what I would have wanted to say. Because in reality, Paul was preaching that Christ had fulfilled it, that there was no reason to continue to try to keep the law. And what these Israelites were offended at is that they wanted to keep on doing it. And they thought it was really offensive for Paul to tell people they didn't have to. Now, it's interesting that they were believing Jews. The elders make that very clear, that they had believed Christ. But they were still zealous for the law. And in Jerusalem, the elders didn't see any contradiction in this. These believing Jews were still probably eating according to Jewish law. They were keeping the holidays. They were likely following the clothing laws. They were likely still circumcising their children. All of this was happening. It was ingrained in who they were. Now, here's where it gets a little challenging for us. I think so anyway. It's hard for me, a Gentile who hasn't been raised up in the Jewish customs, to put myself in that area. Because it would be like for us when we got saved to say, well, you can no longer celebrate the 4th of July or Thanksgiving. Some very Americanized things. Right? Now, it's not the perfect correlation, but I think you get the idea. For the Jewish people, these things of the law were so closely related to their race as Israelites as much as to their religion. And if you remember when we had the dinner, the Seder dinner, and that was a Jewish girl who was a believer, who was raised in a Jewish home, whose parents had turned to Christ, and yet they still observed the Passover. They still did the dinner. They still did all of that. Was that because they were looking to that as their salvation, as their work? No, it was just their tradition, just a important part of their family. And so I think what these Israelites who had turned to Christ and trusted in Christ, It's not like they were saying, and it's important to note, they weren't looking at this as their salvation. They weren't looking at this as a basis of their faith, but they also looked at it as a very important about who they were as a people. As an Israelite, they still wanted to do these things, and they thought Israelites should still do those things. Does that make sense? And because of a Jewish person as a race was so closely tied to being a follower of the Jewish religion, it was hard to separate those things. Now, I still think if you could argue that if the church in Jerusalem was as vigilant at preaching the freedom from the law as Paul was, it would have really toned down this problem. But I think you can counter-argue that if they were to do that, they would likely be slamming the door on any further converts from Judaism. And that's a tough balance, and that did matter to Paul. Keeping the door open to Jews did matter to him, and he did do some things. If you remember back in Acts chapter 16, when Timothy came on the scene, in verse 3 it says, Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So here, in order to be able to have ministry with the Jews that were in the regions that they were going to go to, Paul said, we need to circumcise Timothy so that they will even accept us. So it did matter to Paul. And he was even willing to do things that he knew were not necessary for any kind of salvation, any kind of building their faith, but instead to help them in their ministry, to open doors in their ministry. So it is interesting to think in those terms, that Paul had Timothy get circumcised, and it almost seems contradictory to the statements of the Jerusalem council that said that if you didn't need to be circumcised if you were a Gentile. Timothy was part Gentile. His father was a Greek, his mom was a Jew. So he didn't necessarily have to be circumcised according to the council's statements, which we'll read here in a few minutes. But had Paul gone back to another way of thinking already? Well, no, Paul wasn't convinced by the Judaizers of a different thought. In fact, it was Paul who had argued that Christ alone is the basis for forgiveness, and circumcision had nothing to do with it. It had to do with circumcision of the heart more than anything. It's setting apart the heart. So Paul's action is solely to accommodate to the sensitivities of the Jews. And that's what we see there in verse 3. Because of the Jews who were in those places, Paul said this was the right thing to do. And because he was well known to be a Jewish Greek, Paul knew that the Jews were not going to listen to him if he didn't get Timothy circumcised. It would have been an offense to those Jewish people. So in Jerusalem, even more of a Jewish central place where everyone was following the law if you were a Jew, and that was most of the people that were there were Jewish, it would have been very difficult for ministry to continue on if you were also proclaiming the law is passed, we don't need to follow it anymore. Now you could argue and say, well, who cares if they get offended? The gospel's offensive, right? Preach it anyway, who cares? Well, Paul does care, and he cared back when he got Timothy circumcised. And he would always go to the synagogue first to proclaim the gospel and to talk to the Jews. And, he was faithful to do so. So, and obviously with Timothy, he knew he wasn't going to be able to get in the synagogue if Timothy wasn't circumcised. And if that was his kind of mode of going about life, going about ministry, he was going to need to get Timothy circumcised. So what we see these elders tell Paul is, listen, we've got a problem. Verse 21 says, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. Now notice what they've been told there. Was that true? No, as far as what we can tell, Paul never said that. Paul didn't say for the Jews to forsake the laws of Moses. He didn't tell them that that was the right thing to do. Paul did object to Gentile believers being required to follow the Jewish laws, but he didn't say anything about the Jews continuing to follow the Jewish customs and laws. He did say that they wouldn't do any good for salvation, but he didn't say that it was wrong to follow law just because you wanted to continue to do that. And you can see that throughout his teaching and throughout his writing. Think about Galatians and his condemnation of Peter in that book. If people are telling Gentiles that they need to become Jewish in their law following, that was a problem. And then with Peter's situation, and Peter never said that the Gentiles needed to follow law. What Peter did was wouldn't eat with them because they weren't following the law. So basically he was saying, I can't fellowship with you unless you follow law, which was basically saying you need to follow law. And Paul said, that's not right. You shouldn't have to follow law. Now, on the other side of it, well, like we saw with Timothy, Paul was faithful to follow the law when it was expedient for the spread of the gospel, such as Timothy. So what these guys have done, and they've obviously thought about that, and it almost seems like they bypass all the great things that Paul's done with the Gentiles and go right to this thought of like spinning whatever's happening. It says here, what then is to be done? They answer their own question. They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. So, what's to be done? Here's the plan. And they had a plan. I think you can see their deep concern over what was going to happen. They were very bothered about this situation because it really could cause a lot of problems for them within the church. If they supported Paul, or word got out that Paul was fellowshipping with them and that these church leaders would be accused of being willing to side with Paul over this issue. So what their plan is that they have 4 guys who are under a Nazirite vow. Now, those who are under a Nazirite vow would abstain from wine and strong drink and grape juice, any grapes, raisins, anything. They would avoid any contact with anything that would defile them, such as contact with a dead body, and they would not cut their hair. And when the time of the vow was over, often it was a 30-day vow, they would cut their hair and present an offering in the temple. If Paul went with them and personally paid for the cost of their offering, it would show that he did not object to the Jewish converts following Old Testament customs voluntarily, so long as those same customs were not required of the Gentile believers. So they said, Paul, you need to pay their expenses to finish this vow. Now you might ask yourself, what is he talking about? What are these expenses? If you turn back to Numbers chapter 6, we see the expenses involved in finishing a vow. The beginning of the whole chapter 6 is about the Nazirite vow. I don't want to read the whole chapter. I want to start in verse 13, where it talks about how they conclude. It says, and this is the law of the Nazirite. When the time of his separation has been completed, he shall be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and he shall bring his gift to the Lord, 1 male lamb a year old without blemish for a burnt offering, and 1 ewe lamb a year old without blemish as a sin offering, and 1 ram without blemish as a peace offering. And a basket of unleavened bread, loaves of fine flour mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers smeared with oil, and their grain offering and their drink offerings. And the priest shall bring them before the Lord, and offer his sin offering and his burnt offering. He shall offer the ram as a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, with a basket of unleavened bread. The priest shall offer also its grain offering and its drink offering, and the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire that is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. And the priest shall take the shoulder of the ram when it is boiled, and 1 unleavened loaf out of the basket, and 1 unleavened wafer, and shall put them on the hands of the Nazirite after he has shaved the hair of his consecration. And the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. They are holy portion for the priest, together with the breast that is weighed and the thigh that is contributed, and after that the Nazirite may drink wine. So that was the plan. Now, you think about that. They were supposed to have a male lamb a year old without blemish. They had a ewe lamb a year old without blemish, and they had a ram without blemish. We're talking 3 different animals, plus the flour, plus the unleavened bread. That would be an expensive thing for someone to do for 4 people. And so Paul, what they tell Paul is, we want you to go and pay for all of that for these 4 guys. And what that's going to show all the Jews around is that you're on our side and follow the Jewish law yourself. You're fine with it. Now, here's what I expected Paul to do. To jump up on the pulpit and start screaming at him. Okay? That's what I expected him to do. But it's not what he did. What does Paul do? Paul does exactly what they asked him to do. Now, before that, look at verse 25. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. Now that was from way back in Acts chapter 15, in their letter after Paul comes to the Jerusalem council at that point in time, and the Jerusalem council responds with, here's how we want to handle the Gentiles. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, from what has been strangled, from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you do well, farewell. So I don't know why they put it in here again. It's like they want to just re-emphasize the fact that the Gentiles aren't supposed to be doing these things. So what we see in verse 26 is it says, then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So Paul did exactly what they asked. He went into the temple and did that. Now, what we're going to see next time is it doesn't end up well for Paul anyway. There's the irony in all of this. But why did Paul do what he was asked? Wouldn't this be a compromise to appease people who were obviously confused about the law? I would argue yes. Obviously, Paul did not think so, and here's why. And I think this is a good reminder to us. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Why did Paul do what he did? For the sake of the gospel. The reality is that sometimes we see in Paul's life what seems to be contradictions, and in his mind he says it's not contradictions because I have my mind focused on one thing, and that's the gospel. Now that's hard for a black and white guy like me to figure out. I'll be honest with you. It's hard for me to wrap my head around that. If you're the kind of person that really likes very black and white, very this is wrong, this is right, never the two mix, when you read that and you see what Paul does, that's hard to process. Isn't it? And what I do know from my my time in the ministry, I guess, and my time dealing with people, because a lot of this doesn't necessarily apply to us today. We don't have people that are trying to keep us in the law and following the Jewish customs. That's not too much of an issue. I'm glad for that, by the way. Makes life a little bit easier. But I think you can see an application even today with how we interact with people. Sometimes we should really extend grace and be willing to have conversations and do it in a graceful way. Not always do all people need to be hit over the head with a hammer in every circumstance. What do I mean by that? Well, there's some people that have the mindset that I'm going to be right no matter what, and I'm going to show you I'm right no matter what. And what does that do for the sake of the gospel? Many times in relationships, it can end them. You don't have another opportunity to share the gospel with them. Were you right in what you said? Maybe. But if you just ended that relationship and can no longer talk to them and they will not listen to you and you've totally turned them off, has that done you any good? Now, I understand there's a balance there because you also want to be willing to say the gospel's offensive, and if someone gets upset with me for sharing the gospel, hey, they have to deal with it. They're going to answer for that. And that's true. But you look at some of the hot topics today. You get an argument with somebody about homosexuality. Instead of proclaiming the gospel, you many times will not have an opportunity to share the gospel with them again. Now, does that mean we're softening our stance on homosexuality? No. It just means you're choosing your conversations. You have a conversation with somebody, about any of those, any issue that's not the gospel, and you become dogmatic and in your face and not gracious, and I think you can be in that same spot of ending any opportunity again to share the gospel. And it happens a lot today, especially with social media. Nothing worse than a Christian arguing on social media. It just isn't. It doesn't go well. It doesn't end well. And so there's that tendency, and I have that tendency. I love to be right. I just do. Okay? I love to fight until I'm right and just I'll show you. But sometimes that attitude, like Paul had every right to go in there and say, you bunch of morons. No, this is not how it works. But he didn't do that. He said, okay, if that's what you want me to do, that's what I'll do. Now, you may argue and say, well, yeah, but look what happened then. He got imprisoned. Well, that was part of God's plan from the beginning anyway. No matter what he did, that was going to happen. So I don't think you can look at this as God punishing Paul for not taking a stand on this issue. I don't think you can say that. I think Paul was being all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. And I think we could learn a lesson from that. As much as it kind of grinds at me that he didn't take a stand against these Jewish people that really caused problems and still causes problems within Judaism today. That bothers me, but I guess I have enough understanding of Paul and his heart to understand why he did what he did. Does that make sense? It's for the sake of the gospel. And so sometimes I think we as believers have to guard our conversations, guard our arguments, guard being right, and make sure that, your argument about silly things doesn't limit your opportunity to share the gospel. Politics is another great area to really shoot yourselves in the foot. Argue about politics, and then people will just turn you off. And that's the challenge. Are we really concerned about the gospel? Are we putting that first? If we are, and if that is our concern, then we have to be careful on how we interact in every other area. We just do. I'm not perfect at that. I'm going to raise my hand right now, okay? I'm still figuring that out. But I think that's the example we can learn from this passage, the truth we can learn from this passage, that it should be we become all things to all people in order to proclaim the gospel. Live for Christ so that you have that opportunity to proclaim the gospel. Doesn't mean we compromise or stand on the gospel in order to proclaim the gospel. That doesn't make any sense. That's what Paul withstood Peter to the face about. But it does mean all those other areas, sometimes we should just really extend some grace and shut up, to put it bluntly. All right? Let's pray. Lord, help us to be willing to extend